Hi, everybody. Today's Wednesday, December 31st, 2025. And our dear friend Matt Ho is here with us. Welcome back, Matt.
Hi, Nima. It's good to see you.
Happy New Year, by the way.
Yeah, Happy New Year to
Yeah,
you. You've got a few hours left, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
We have
Yeah.
almost 3 hours
Okay.
left, to be.
Okay.
Let me start with what's going on with the case of Colonel Jacques in Europe.
Mm.
I uh, I'm sure that you're aware of what's going on with him with the case of the sanctions on him and the people who feel differently about what's going on in Ukraine or maybe in the Middle East, but the European Union going against these people, trying to put pressure on them. What is, in your opinion, happening to Europe? The continent was for such a long time advocating free speech, democracy, and right now they're hitting those people who are advocating for peace, advocating for the end of the conflict. How can we understand that?
I think there's an idea that these things are natural, that you're on a pendulum, and people can recall that not so very long ago, this idea of how much Europe embraced free speech was seen almost perilous, right? That they are so far gone on the other side of these things that they are going to doom themselves. And then, you have pendulums that swing back, and people see that in societies around the world, certainly in the United States. You see that you can't have a Barack Obama without getting a Donald Trump, right? I mean, so but in this case, I don't think that's what's happening here, Nima. I don't think this is natural. I don't think this is just how history works. I think this is the reality of an elite in Europe that is endangered and is in peril themselves uh, due to the fact that their policies have bankrupted Europe. They have failed to invest in their people. They have gone along with this relish of being the first among the vassals of the American Empire. To the point that their situation, their position, is in danger from anyone who threatens this view, this understanding, this image of Europe as a bulwark of democracy against authoritarianism, right? This idea of bulwark of Europe as the leading vehicle of not just Western values, but of modernity. That the age of liberalism has peaked with this European elite. And so anyone who threatens them in any way, including by just saying factual information, or in the case of Colonel Bod, my understanding that the EU sanctions are based upon literally his just quoting Ukrainian officials, that even quoting your own allies, if it's not not if it doesn't conform to the narrative that supports this ruling class, this elite, then you are going to be in danger. And that's what we're seeing here. So it's not anything, again, that's natural. It's not the normal pendulum swing of history in terms of liberal to illiberal, etc. But rather, it's a concern by the elites in Europe that their hold on power is incredibly tenuous. And so they have to stamp down anything that threatens them. The idea of essentially making Colonel Bod as an example. I think there's some vindictiveness in this too. Let's not forget that. There's some anger at the effrontery, at the impotence of someone like Colonel Bod, or even any of us who are speaking on these issues have. Who are they to challenge us type of thing. It's always going to come, whether it's the empire itself or its vassals. But and we have to remember too that the Europeans have a long history, a long legacy of being empires themselves. Right. So this is cultural to them. This is in their genes. This is in their DNA to act like this, the elites there. But this idea of putting the fear of the empire, whether again it's the empire or its chief vassals, into those who would dare speak truth to power is a large part of this, and it certainly is done in a deliberate manner in order to try and silence other critics.
When I compare the United States to Europe, I see a significant and very crucial difference. I remember when the very same day they raided Scott Ritter's house.
Hmm.
FBI raided his house. We were going to talk to each other. We had a live planned. To we were going to go live, but they raided his house. They seized his passport. They didn't let him to get out of the United States. But after all, he was free to express his feeling, the way he thinks about the conflict in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and with the case of China. Nobody tried to silence him in those days. But what's going on in Europe is totally the opposite way. You see, the Europeans are doing everything. This is not a judicial process against Colonel Jack Bull. This is a political decision on the part of the European. I don't know who's behind it. Maybe Kaya Kallas is behind it, and the people, who are working for her. But how do you see the difference between the United States and Europeans?
Even I don't see that much of a difference, because, yeah, as you referenced Scott's affair with the FBI, whether it was the FBI raiding his house or him being detained at the airport, both things happened within months of each other last year. That was under the Biden administration. And under the Biden administration, you also saw the suppression of free speech on American campuses across the country, including criminalizing it. In various states, that was all underneath the Biden administration. You certainly had suppression of political speech by the pressure put onto technology companies by the Biden administration. You had the prosecution of the what's it called, the Africa Workers Party, if I'm remembering it correctly, by the Biden administration for supposedly being in cahoots with the Russians. And the Trump administration has kept that up, going after certainly any organizations, any individuals speaking on behalf of Palestine, but also to those speaking on behalf of immigrant rights. The threat of suppression, whether it be arrest, whether it be deportation, whether it be financial ruin, by the Trump administration is very clear. You had presidential security, presidential, excuse me, and MPSM 7, National Presidential Security Memorandum number 7, issued by the president earlier this year, that lists about 20 different qualifications that make up what a domestic terrorist is. And then you have reporting in the last month or so, particularly by Ken Klippenstein, detailing how the Justice Department has instructed the FBI to start putting together lists of domestic terrorists. So I don't really see a difference here between the Americans and the Europeans. I mean, we could go on with the Americans sanctioning, say, the ICC, the International Criminal Court. Because it is rightfully going after the Israeli war criminals. So what I see is this is what empire does. And again, whether it's the United States or its chief vassal Europe, it's very clear. And this is Vladimir Putin made this, and of course, Vladimir Putin and the Russians, no fans of free speech. They just imprisoned, gave lengthy prison sentences to political opponents in Russia in the last week or two. So certainly the hypocrisy is there on both sides here. But I think Vladimir Putin did get it correct, though, when he described the Europeans recently as small piglets, and the idea being that they can't survive without the mother sow. Right. So this idea, this image of the Europeans not being able to survive without the American empire, that the Europeans suckling on the American empire, I think that's an image that most people would say, yeah, that's correct. But this idea of the repression of civil liberties, the suppression of free speech, of journalism, it's taken place, here in the United States. It's taking place in Europe. It's taking place in Russia. It's a worldwide issue. We've seen the Israelis, of course, do this. The Saudis do this. I mean, it's hard to name a place where you have a freedom of speech and a freedom to practice journalism, as I think many of our values say that we do.
I think it could be helpful and important to analyze what was the outcome of the first year of the presidency of Donald Trump. You know, because we are approaching 1 year that he's in power, and one of the very first promises, very important promises that he had before coming to power was the conflict in Ukraine, to put an end to the conflict in 24 hours. Are we close to put an end to the conflict in Ukraine?
I certainly hope so. Right? I mean, I think anyone who's decent agrees with that. Anyone who's not on the take here, whether it's the military industrial complex or in the case of the European leaders we were just discussing, who need this war to keep themselves in power. I think that that's so much of their motivation, is that they believe that their political identity is so beholden to this idea of fighting the Russians. That peace to them is politically ruinous. But we certainly, over the last 4 years, are in the best position to see an end to this war. Whether you want to call it peace or something else, that's fine with me. But certainly, an end to the fighting, an end to the war, is desperately needed. For a variety of reasons, just to end the suffering on both sides, the hundreds of thousands of families on both sides who have suffered losses, let alone the devastation to the environment, the risk of escalation, et cetera, et cetera. But certainly, I think we are at a place where an end is possible. It, you know, so much of this is dependent upon the whims of Donald Trump, which is quite scary. But we also wouldn't be in this position if it was not for Donald Trump's ego, right? As well as, I think, for his gut that tells him that this is fundamentally wrong, that there's no value in this. I don't think Donald Trump is approaching this with a issue of morality. I think he's coming to a sense of there's no value here, there's no worth in this destruction, in this killing, in this fighting, in the risks that come from it. And so I think that's primarily where Donald Trump is coming from. I think what you have is this place where the four sides are not backing away from it, where you could have had very easily any four of the participants in this, the US, Europe, Russia, and Ukraine, having backed out by now. And they haven't. And I think that's the most important thing, is that, as ugly as it may seem, as the back and forth continues, as it seems like there will never be an end to this diplomacy, that's okay. It takes a long time to resolve these things, particularly when the starting points for the two sides are so far apart. And the fact that we've narrowed to this point where it's a question of, okay, the Ukrainians are saying that they will leave the Donbass if it turns into this free economic zone, and the Russians do the same thing, or at least don't backfill the areas that the Ukrainian troops leave. If that's where the point we're at now, holy cow, where we've come then from where we were in where both sides had staked out what they have wanted, what their goals were. This is quite remarkable. Including even the idea that the Russians are willing to give up total control of both Kherson and Zaporizhia. The idea that the Russians have brought those provinces, along with Donetsk and Luhansk, into the government, into the country, made them official parts of Russia. And now that the Russians are going to say, oh, we're only going to take half or two-thirds of those provinces, that's a really big deal. That's a really big compromise on the Russians' part, I believe. Certainly for reasons we've discussed, the Europeans don't want to see this go through. They would prefer war unto them, but I think they understand the writing on the wall. The leaks that come out, various things, we have to understand that when they're being said, whether it's a leak or it's an actual statement, there's an agenda behind them. and they're trying to gain leverage, or they're trying to maintain face, or they're trying not to give away the whole loaf until the very end here. So I think when you see these reports, like I saw today, the Ukrainians saying that, or the Poles too, saying that the Americans agreed to put troops into Ukraine. Yeah, I think that's just posturing. I don't think the Americans actually said that. It just doesn't make any sense to me. It goes against what everything this administration's been saying, as well as the administration has to understand that that is a fundamental reason for this war. This notion of NATO threatening Russia, so somehow Russia's going to accept the idea of American troops, let alone European troops in Ukraine. So, I mean, I think we're in a good place relative to where we were before, which is very easy to say because where we were before, particularly under the Biden administration, was you know the shame that should come on the Biden administration for continuing this war, particularly as time goes by and more things come out. And I'm sure you saw that former Biden administration official, Amanda Sloat, who was the director of European Affairs for the National Security Council, being asked, and it was a prank. She thought she was talking to somebody else. She didn't think she didn't realize who she was talking to, but essentially saying yes, this war could have been averted through talks. Negotiations would have averted this war, to paraphrase her. I mean, so that came from the National Security Director for European Affairs for the United States. So, long winded response as usual from me, Nima. But I think that we are in a good place here going forward. I think Trump has ideas in his head of what he wants to see. There's reporting he wants to make announcements about various things at the World Economic Forum, including about Gaza, which is not in a good place. But certainly, I think with this, if a compromise can be made on that western part, particularly of Donetsk, if there's can be some agreement found, if security agreements can be committed to, which I don't fully understand, particularly as the security agreements that are being leaked about seem to be one something that the Russians won't accept, but also two, go against everything the Americans have been saying this last year about what their national security plans, what their ideas are, how they envision going forward in terms of relations with Europe and Russia. It just doesn't make sense. But we'll see what happens with that. And then things like the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. I don't know why that's an issue. I mean, I know it's why it's an issue, but like that seems like something that could be figured out in terms of some type of power sharing agreement, distribution of power, who controls it, bring the IAEA in to run it, make it an international power station. There's different ways that could be done. So I would hope to think, I would like to think that in the next month or two, we'll see a ceasefire and an agreement. It won't be, I think, something that will bring about a full degree of stability, because I don't think we're going to see a truly neutral Ukraine, which is what's needed. Just like we needed a truly neutral Austria and Finland following the Second World War. I don't think we're going to see that, but I think there's going to be something that at least will keep the peace for the foreseeable future. But there's a lot of dangers of that too. A lot of dangers that come with it.
Matt, we have Steve Witkoff together with Kushner. They were negotiating in the Middle East. And we know what's going on with the so called peace plan in the Middle East and their plan for Gaza. And basically, what they have done and what they're talking about is what's in it for me. How
Mm-hmm.
can we get from what's going on with the situation in Gaza? What is how we can benefit from the situation? And I'm afraid it could be the case for the war in Ukraine. These two guys are negotiating, but after all, diplomacy, we know how important, for example, when you have, Lavrov negotiating with the United States is totally different from you having Kirill Dmitriev talk with Americans. These are not diplomats. These are
Right.
not trained to solve the issues. These are, somehow they know how to deal with each other when it comes to their sort of negotiations in terms of the economy, but they have no clue when it comes to having, reaching a permanent solution, somehow a sustainable solution for the conflict in Ukraine.
Right, right. You know, my colleague Karen Kiyotowski, she describes Trump's foreign policy as profit-seeking, cronyism, and deceitful wars. And I think that's a good summarization of what we're dealing with here in terms of the personalities involved, what they're looking for. Certainly, this understanding of what am I getting out of it? How do we line our pockets? And we saw that in the first draft of this peace proposal, this idea that $100 billion would be taken and this was in a 28-point plan. $100 billion would be taken from Russian frozen assets, and it would be invested in reconstruction in Ukraine, and that the Russians and the Americans would split the profits. So, I mean, you go back and look at that 28-point peace plan. The idea of profits dominates the section on reconstruction. Normally that's something that's hidden. So anyone who's familiar with the development industry knows how dirty it is, knows how corrupt it is, knows how so much of that money just ends up back in American banks and American companies and eventually in American political campaign coffers. But the here they're saying it out loud, right? They weren't even trying to hide it. Normally, a reconstruction program of that magnitude, oh gosh, the vultures that would be circling, type of thing. What as it says in the Gospel of Luke, right? What does Jesus say? Where the dead be, thereby vultures gather, right? And that's certainly something that I think articulates the American view towards reconstruction, post-war reconstruction, however it's phrased. So, this idea that yes, they want to line their pockets, that what's in it for me dominates their thinking. We've seen that expressed in Ukraine. We've seen that expressed since the beginning of this war that started in 2022. I know it started in 2014, but just in the idea of the American banks that went to Ukraine and essentially got commitments to be the ones who are going to rebuild Ukraine after the war, right? I'm not sure where that stands now, but certainly you saw that early on in this, the profit taking that was going to be, and who are these banks? Well, they're the friends, the cronies of the Biden administration, right? I mean, so we see how this is all this war, like all wars, are a racket. In the immortal words of Marine Corps General Smedley Butler, I think it's very clear the idea of the profit seeking of what's in it for me by the Trump administration with the Gaza plan, which also negotiated by Witkoff and Kushner. And I think that's even more explicit. This idea of monetizing 70% of the Gaza coastline, as was revealed in a Wall Street Journal story a week or so ago. The idea that is the plan is called Project Sunrise, and it foresees this investment that yields tremendous profits. And whether or not the Palestinian people are involved is not even secondary or tertiary to these people. So the idea of conquest here, whether it come through the literal obliteration of a people like the Palestinian people in Gaza, or in the sense of being the decision maker, the kingmaker, however you want to describe it, of the United States in the Ukraine-Russia negotiations. I don't think anyone disputes the idea that the Americans are the ones who can decide the fate of this thing. Certainly not saying the Russians and Ukrainians don't have agency, but the United States is such an important, such an important factor in all this that it really is up to the Americans how this goes forward. And again, the Russians can walk away anytime. The Ukrainians can do as they wish. The Europeans are certainly doing their best to sabotage this, etc. But the primacy of the Americans in this, well, that is a form of, well, because we are this dominant factor for the American leadership through Trump, Witkoff, Kushner. Well, that means we should get spoils, right? I mean, so you see this grotesque profit taking, cronyism, deceitful wars, as Karen would say, that define and really help you understand Trump foreign policy, not as it's expressed in the national security policy that was put out a few weeks ago, but as it's actually expressed in action, whether it be military action like we're seeing impending in Venezuela, or diplomatic action, whether it be Ukraine or Palestine. I will say this one thing, I think that is really uh, notable about uh, what's happening in Ukraine and Russia in terms of negotiations is the role of the United States as both a belligerent and as the mediator, right? So this idea that the United States is a belligerent in the conflict, but it's also the mediator. I'm not sure if I'm aware of a conflict, a war, a situation where you had that type of setup like we see here. And of course, I think a lot of us have trepidations about that. But as of now, as we were saying, it's led to the point under the Trump administration where maybe there will be an end to this war, or at least some form of peace.
It doesn't matter how many times Donald Trump repeats that this is Biden's war. We know this is this war started in 2014 with the Obama administration, then the Trump administration, Biden administration, Donald Trump 2.0 right now. But do you feel that they're doing the same? The Trump administration is doing the same in Taiwan by sending more weapons to Taiwan?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think the Trump administration with Taiwan, in the same way that they were in the first part, are pushing the bounds here, that they're doing everything to provoke, that they're doing everything they can to satisfy those in Washington, D.C. who do want war and feeling that they can manage it and bring it right up to the lines. The idea of we're going to push, we're going to provoke, we're going to poke the Chinese for our political domestic benefit. Absolutely. I think that's what you saw happen with the Obama administration. When I was in Washington, D.C. In 2014, 2015, involved in some efforts on Capitol Hill, and you could see the Obama administration, the scratch marks on the door jam as the Obama administration is getting pulled further and further into this conflict with Russia. Chiefly from whether it's the weapons industry that wants this, the fossil fuel industry, the Europeans that want it, and also, too, most importantly, members of Congress who were ravenous for it. And you see that now with China. We've seen it for decades. But, in this last national defense authorization that was just, passed in the last few weeks, there is legislation as part of the NDA that directs the Department of Defense to send more ships through the Taiwan Straits. This idea of sending these freedom of navigation patrols, as they call them, which is simply just going and poking the Chinese, right? I mean, this idea of go out there and see if you can get into a fight kind of thing. This is, I think, something that the Americans, I should say it like that, many Americans in Washington, D.C. have wanted for a very long time. The idea that China should be our next enemy is nothing new. If you go back and look at the mid 90s, the rise in concern, if you want to call that, by American leadership, foreign policy leadership about China is there. And certainly the way that the Clinton administration transitions to putting an emphasis on the Pacific, highlighted, of course, with flare-ups over Taiwan, including sending 2 aircraft carrier battle groups up to China's shoreline, essentially, and saying, what are you going to do about it? That impact on the Chinese, has led us to this point we are now. If people remember Condoleezza Rice, when she comes into office as George W. Bush's national security advisor in 2001, she says that China is the primary concern of the United States. Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda had something else to say about that, of course. Right? I mean, Barack Obama, his Asia pivot, this was supposed to define his second administration. The Asia pivot under Obama is more or less canceled, if you will, because of course Al Qaeda and the Islamic State in Syria have other things to say about that, right? I mean, so I bring up those 2 points though, just to always remind people that so much of the reality of this world is made through the United States making, right? So the 2001 September 11 attacks, it's a direct consequence, a direct blowback of American foreign policy over the decades. Of course, the situation in Syria, whether it's that ruinous, horrible, awful civil war or the reality of Islamic State, it's all consequence of America's actions. So the Americans who want to pivot and start this new conflict with China keep getting frustrated by this old conflict that they've created, right? And particularly if you go back to the genesis of Al Qaeda and the reason for that conflict with Al Qaeda, it goes back, it's a Cold War legacy. Al Qaeda exists because of our war with the Soviet Union. So, I mean, the idea that the Americans can't get out of their way and the reality that the legacy of their action carries on for decades, the blowback is just not a one time occurrence. And it spans through generations. I don't think that's something that the United States really fully has understood. But certainly the rhetoric about China, the discussion, the obsession with China is there in the United States, in Washington, throughout Congress. And I don't think Donald Trump wants to get into a war with China, but I think his administration likes the idea of, again, somehow pushing the bounds of it, poking the Chinese, getting domestic political benefits from this, pleasing the various constituencies in Washington, D.C. that want war or at least like the idea of war with China. And of course, that may very well deliver the war that they fantasize about. And, I think almost all of us, right, Nima, including I feel probably most folks who are listening and watching us right now would agree that the United States doesn't have a chance in hell in a war with China. We wouldn't be able to survive after a few weeks. At the wherewithal of the Chinese in terms of their industrial capacity would just eventually overwhelm the Americans. I don't care about how great one size technology is or the other. The fact that Chinese haven't fought a war in however many decades and they don't have the experience, none of that matters. Will come down a war like that to industrial capacity, measured not over years, but in months. And I think that would be the reality of it for the Americans in a loss in a war with China.
Yeah. Matt, looking at the Middle East and the West Asia today, it seems to me so much of change, so much strange somehow. When you when you see Saudi Arabia is attacking, two ships of UAE weapons going to Yemen, I have never thought that these two countries gonna attack each other. And not just Saudi Arabia and UAE. You look at Netanyahu going to Cyprus together with Greece, somehow making some sort of coalition. On the other hand, Erdogan is going to be here in Iran and talking with Iranian officials. What is happening to the Middle East, in your opinion, and how this sort of endless wars is changing the face of the Middle East? Because in my opinion, what's going on within the Arab states, considering the foreign policy, somehow after the attack on Doha, various calculations are somehow modified. They're modifying their calculations right now.
Right. I think, well, and don't forget another big thing that's happened in the last week or so is that massive natural gas deal between Israel and Egypt, where Egypt's going to buy, what, $35 billion worth of gas, excuse me, from Israel. I think these are the consequences of the last 2 years of war, whether it be war, whether it be the genocide in Gaza, whether it be Lebanon, Syria, strikes on Iraq, of course, the war with Iran, the battles with the Houthis, and that the United States and the Israelis have come out dominant, and particularly the Israelis. The Americans, I think, have learned a lesson of being overextended. And we tie this back to just talked about with China, but no, and I shouldn't say they've learned a lesson. They should learn a lesson about being overextended, but I don't know if those, as Larry Wilkerson likes to quote Barbara Tuchman, the wooden headedness of Washington D.C. has been penetrated by reality. The I think what you've seen is, regrettably, strategic success by the Israelis. Now, there's all kinds of issues with Israel internally that might be its undoing. So we can talk about that otherwise. But at least geopolitically, on a regional front, the dominance of the Israelis is clear. And I think most nations are recognizing that. Now, where that will go, we have to see. I mean, certainly said it before, why the Turks haven't started getting a nuclear weapon yet, I don't understand. I don't know. Very well could happen. Other nations as well, But the idea that the Israelis are establishing a degree of primacy, in a large part due to the backing of the United States, is evident. And I think what you're seeing then, in terms of the willingness of nations to work with Israel, recognizing the reality that's in front of them, right? So this includes things, such as been reported about increased military ties between Gulf states and the Israelis. Working through the Americans, but in a way that no way you would have thought possible even 5, 6 years ago. I think there's that recognition. What comes with that then, it's curious. It is this bombing by the Saudis of the of STCs, of the Southern Transitional Council's vehicles. And if people, I think, who follow this will know, they saw the video of that, all those white pickup trucks, and it's just as a aside, still never figured out where all those white pickup trucks come from. Seen them all my life in these conflicts, and but yeah, this idea that the Saudis would attack the STC, which is clearly an Emirati allied organization, and then the Emiratis pull out of Yemen as well. Okay, there's something happening here in terms of a balancing of power, and in terms of maybe the Emiratis not wanting to be overextended. Certainly, I think with Yemen, we get into particulars about Yemen. The STC have recently taken large parts of the two eastern parts of Yemen. They want to declare independence, make their own South Yemen. That's something that the Saudis do not want. So, did the Emiratis know this was coming? And did the Emiratis understand that, okay, the STC is going too far, the pushing the bounds of what the Saudis want here? This isn't worth it for us. We're not that wedded to the idea of controlling Yemen. We'd rather have better relations with the Saudis, let the Saudis bomb these guys, try and get some control. Is that what, let the Saudis deal with Yemen? Is that what the Emiratis are saying at this point? It's not worth it for us, possibly. But, you're seeing a shift in the region because of the last 2 years of the genocide. And of course, if you go back and you look at the root causes, the fundamental reasons for why Al-Aqsa flood took place, why the Palestinian resistance carried out those attacks on October 7th, the geopolitical realities that were being forced upon the Palestinians by the Abraham Accords really were a prime motivation. There are many other motivations too, but that was a prime issue for the Palestinians. This idea that we're being left behind. All these nations are signing up for the Abraham Accords. The Trump administration, well, at that point they were still a year out, but the idea that no one was going to back us. Eventually, everyone was going to just leave the Palestinians behind. We have to do something about this. Make it at least not go out quietly. And unfortunately, the realities 2 years on from Al-Aqsa flood was that was not successful. That goal by the Palestinian resistance was not achieved. That certainly you don't have to look any farther than the UN Security Council resolution. That put the Trump, Witkoff, Netanyahu Gaza plan into international law. If you want to talk about if you need proof that the Palestinians have been abandoned and left on their own, there it was. Algeria, of all nations, votes against the Palestinians in that. They have no friends, no one who's willing to stand with them, with the exception of the Houthis. The rest of the countries that were supposedly in the acts of resistance with them have all been weakened. They've been shut down. They've been deterred by the Israelis. So again, you go back to this idea of the strategic success of the Israelis and the Americans over the last couple of years. It's undoubtable. I mean, it's we can go nation by nation if you want throughout the region, but that's there. And so I think there is that reality that has descended upon the Middle East that for the foreseeable future, Israel is dominant. And that as long as they have the Americans backing, which, despite public opinion polls and sentiment and what else in the US, I don't see that changing. I mean, does anyone doubt that this memorandum of understanding that provides the Israelis $3.8 billion dollars a year that's coming to expire won't be renewed? Very possibly will be doubled to 20 years. And that 3.8 billion, if that's what we gave the Israelis back in 2015, what are we going to give them now? If we gave them almost 4 billion a year 10 years ago, we can give them 5 billion, 6 billion, $10 billion a year now. If Congress will do that, of course it will. No matter what the public opinion polls say. So, yeah, I mean, I think this is the awful reality that we're facing is that no matter how much we understood what the Palestinian resistance was attempting to achieve, how much we sided with them and backed them and supported them and sympathized with them, that they lost. And this is the awful reality that's facing not just the Palestinian people, but I think the entire region.
Matt, what's going on with the case of Israel? I think somehow what has happened between Israel and Lebanon, in Gaza, in Syria, gave Israelis the false signal that they can go after Iran, they can go after even Turkey. Just looking at what's going on in Ukraine, for example. How can you imagine a country of, even Ukraine is a big country. Israel is a country of 8 million people. How can you imagine a country like Israel can fight Iran or fight Turkey? It's impossible. It doesn't matter if you go make a new sort of agreement with South Cyprus, which is insignificant because I know the Cyprus, the North Cyprus, the South Cyprus, and Greece. These are not important militarily, but you can use their land to attack other countries after all. But how much of leverage that could bring to Israel in dealing? Because you see the Israelis right now arguing that Turkey is becoming the worst enemy is growing to be because of their differences, because the differences they have in Syria. You know, it's not just about making some sort of leverage, making some sort of success, as you've mentioned about the way that the Arab states trying to somehow manage their relationship with Israel. But after all, we have two countries in the Middle East. I would argue Iran and Turkey. And Israel is not even comparable with any of these countries. And the United States, I really don't feel that the United States would risk a new war in the Middle East just for the sake of Israel, because that would be, with the case of Venezuela, we know what's going on. With the case of Yemen, we know what has happened with the Trump administration going in the Red Sea, going to the Red Sea to punish Yemenis, Houthis, which wasn't successful after all. They did
Right.
everything. So the calculation, what is the calculation on the part of Israelis? Do they really understand their reality? Or there's somehow they feel that they can do something like they did in Syria? For example, before coming up to this live, we were talking about these new protests here in Iran.
Mhm.
When I haven't been to Iran for more than 12 years. And every time they're talking about protests here in Iran, And I was asking many people, but right now I'm here. I see that nothing significant is happening here. It's all about some sort of propaganda. And I don't know if they're making their decisions based on this propaganda, because the 12-day war started with this sort of mindset that they can do regime change. And they have made, looking at the scale of the war, the way they started the war against Iran, it's all about it. They had a huge network of these people here in Iran working with them. I would argue today, I talk with various officials, diplomats here in Iran. I wanted to know what is their take on what's going on between Iran and the United States and Israel. They're so much confident that if anything happens between Iran and Israel, they're not going to stop it. They're going to go to the end. And what is your understanding of these sort of, Donald Trump said Israel can attack Iran, strike Iran.
Yeah.
With the case of ballistic missile program, if it's nuclear, they can go fast. Uh,
Yeah, I
How do you
think
understand it?
there's a variety of things that come into play here, Nima. One is just the arrogance, the entitlement, the racism involved. I mean, I certainly saw this with the Iraq and Afghan war. Talked to guys about Vietnam in terms of policy and decision making. These people can't beat us, right? So a dismissal of the Iranians because they're not Western, right? The dismissal of the Iranians because they're brown. I mean, whether that's not stated overtly, it's subconsciously there. And like I said, I saw that with Iraq and Afghanistan. These people can't beat us, right? So like that type of chauvinism that is there, whether we want to admit it or not. There's legacies to this, and all nations have this. Certainly when we talk about Russia and we talk about their uh, uh, fear of being attacked, that they have possessed for generations, and for good reason, because we can lay out the whole list going back hundreds of years, going back to Charles the 12th or whoever it was from Sweden, right? I mean, like, that informs the society, and then that informs, of course, the leadership, because that's the narrative, that's the mythology, that's the reality, if you will, right, for the country, and that's what they base their policies on. I mean, for the Americans, this has been for nearly 50 years now, for 45 years, the idea that Iranians are our chief enemy. I mean, if you did a poll of American foreign policy leaders, or even the American public, over the last, say, 45 years, and ask them who are America's three biggest enemies, of course, there'd be different ones rotating in Iraq, in and out, right? Iraq, Libya, etc., Russia, China. You'd have different ones coming in and out, Venezuela. But Iran would be a constant. I have no doubt that at any time in the last 45 years, Iran would have made it into that top three list. And that type of that narrative creates a reality that's undeniable. If you walk into most any office of any type of foreign policy or military or intelligence apparatus in Washington, D.C., or throughout the American national security establishment, the presupposition, the need, the necessity to identify Iran as an enemy is clear. If you and I walked in to talk with a bunch of generals and admirals, or a bunch of foreign relations committee staffers on Capitol Hill, or a bunch of people at think tanks in Washington, D.C., were to show up at the Heritage Foundation or at Center for American Progress or wherever, and we are to say, look, we talked to the Iranians, they'd be, no, can't talk to them. They're our enemies. You guys have got three heads. What are you, from Mars? You guys are simply unserious. So that clouds so much of this. And I know people will say, well, that's too simplistic, or it's too easy to say it like that, but that really is the reality of decision making in not just Washington, D.C., but various capitals. This disproportionality, as you were saying so clearly and so correctly, but between Israel and Turkey, Israel and Iran, Israel and Egypt, right? I mean, but that is balanced, of course, by the weight of the United States. And I think for the Israelis, as long as they understand that they have the backing of the United States, they feel that they are invincible. They are the chosen ones of the empire, and that they can do as they wish. And that's true whether it is, I was listening to Ilan Pappé the other day, the Israeli historian. He describes Israel as being divided between two states, state of Judea and the state of Israel. And Judea being the Zionist, the religious Zionist settler class, and the state of Israel being the more secular, quote, liberal descendants of the European immigration that stood up the socialist state of Israel, that kind of thing, and that there is no division on them when it comes to this understanding. And so, no matter how fractured Israel is internally, they feel that externally in their affairs regionally, they can do as they wish, do as they want because of the American support. And so, I think that is what enables them to do this because, excuse me, because as you said, the disproportionality is there. And we could talk about the United States, how it's overextended, how its
But Matt,
capacity.
sorry for interrupting you. The other issue, in the last 24 hours, we had four these huge cargo planes from Russia coming to Iran. You know, looking at what has happened in Ukraine and the way that China was somehow so shy to support Russia when the war started, and where China is today when the conflict. I don't see China and Russia giving up on Iran because it's hugely problematic for Russia and even China if Iran falls apart. You know, it's the South Caucasus. It's all about, whatever it's looking at Chechnya, looking at the Dagestan. These are even the South Caucasus, Georgia, coming down to Azerbaijan, Armenia. These countries are so much connected today to each other. And the reality is not appreciated, in the West. They don't talk about it. These countries, I have to ask these diplomats here, they don't want to talk about it.
Hmm.
I have to ask them, what is going on? What is your understanding? What is going on between Iran and China and Russia? They're not eager. They don't want to talk about it. But I feel it when I talk with them. It seems something that they don't want to talk about, you know?
Why,
And
why don't they want to talk about it? Do you
because
get a
they
feeling for that?
because they feel somehow that would influence, because the current government in Iran is somehow feels that may influence the sort of, you know the relationship they feel that they want to have with the United States and with Europeans. They don't want to talk about how deep is the relationship between Iran and Russia, Iran and China,
Yeah,
because they want to have. But these people are getting weaker here in Iran.
yeah.
They're not. They're not the majority of the politicians in Iran. They're going weaker.
I think a lot of people, when you talk about this relationship between Russia and Iran, China and Iran, and what happens if you have an American attack on Iran again, which I think, as I agree with you, I think it's incredibly likely. I mean, I think that was what was decided upon by this visit by Netanyahu. And certainly Trump's public comments don't deter any of that. If people remember the first visit by Netanyahu uh, to the White House back in February, and they had people remember they had that uh, standing at the podium, and the uh, assertion by Trump of supporting Israel, whether it be in Gaza or whether it be against Iran, was there. If you go and look back at what he says, it's clear that there's going to be a war. U.S. is going to back Israel militarily here in a war against Iran, and it's going to happen. And I think we got the same thing again. Um, unless somehow there's some capitulation by the Iranians. And then what would the Russians and the Chinese do? You know, I think a lot of us are prone to look at Syria and say, look, the Russians saw that Syria was not worth keeping on, that Assad was a lost cause, that intervening in Syria and protecting the Assad regime was way more than the Russians wanted to do for a variety of reasons. I don't think that's the same calculation with Iran. I don't think the Russians are going to send squadrons of Su-57s and Su-35s down there to protect the Iranians. But certainly the displeasure of the Russians will be demonstrated in some way. And the Chinese, I think, are in a position where Chinese. I think this is really an important juncture for the Chinese. Whether it's this impending war with Iran, as you said, with the relations between China and Iran, or certainly with Venezuela, where we have these ships that are heading to Venezuela right now that are Chinese ships that are not sanctioned by the U.S. Not that that has any international legal meaning, but the fact that what's going to happen here, and what can the Chinese do to stop it? And I think this is going to have a big determinant on both the Russians and the Chinese going farther, going along. Just as we said before about the Turks and the
Mm.
idea that Turks eventually getting a nuclear weapon. Because what are you going to do? Are you going to keep allowing this to happen? So the Chinese have two aircraft carriers now. They don't have the ability to project force. They don't have the ability to go and protect China. The Russians are pretty limited as well to do something like that. So what going forward? What do they do? If I'm the Chinese and I'm looking at this, whether it be Venezuela, whether looking at just the way the Americans bomb and conduct raids all throughout Africa as they want, whether it's Somalia or Nigeria, affecting all types of issues for the Chinese in that way, or it's this issue with Iran, not even talking about Taiwan, but okay, we have to have some type of force projection capability. And that's certainly not the way the Chinese have conducted themselves over the decades. That's certainly not the way any of us see their foreign policy going, unless it's forced upon them. And that's my big fear about this. I don't think the Chinese and the Russians are going to intervene in an Israeli American attack on Iran, just as we saw. I think there'll be support. I don't think they'll need to, because the
Mm.
idea of
Yeah.
the Iranian regime collapsing and the Russians and Chinese having to keep it propped up, that's not there. I think the Russians and Chinese are going to have to watch as their ally is attacked and that they can't really do anything about it. And that's going to motivate them going forward, right? That's going to create this idea for them that's already there. I shouldn't say create, they're already thinking this, of how do we counter this? We can't keep allowing this to happen. And so maybe we won't see, it's speculation, right? Maybe we won't see two Chinese aircraft carrier. We'll see 12, or 11, just like the Americans. I mean, so there's a lot of things here
Yeah.
that are determining what the 2030s, the 2040s, the 2050s are looking to look like.
Yeah. Exactly. Thank you so much, Matt, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Absolutely, Nima. Thank you, and
And
happy
Happy
New
New
Year.
Year. Yeah.
Yeah, happy New Year to you and your family. I'm so happy you're back there with them,
Thank you.
and yeah, happy New Year to everyone who's listening and watching.